Hi, this is Mrs. Solomon, and this lecture is entitled The Gospel Tradition. It is our introduction to the Gospels and is actually a lead-in into our unit on our discussion on the Gospel of Mark. Just so that you know, the way I'm defining tradition here is as any kind of teaching that is written or spoken that is handed down from generation to generation, and so that'll make more sense as we go along in the screencast. So here's where we're going. I'll do an introduction to gospel and what it means. We'll look at gospels as selective documents, how they came to be, from oral transmission to the written accounts, and then we'll take a look at the fact that there are 4 gospels. So first of all, the word gospel comes from the Greek word euangelion, which means good news. But this word is not exclusive to the Christian faith. We first see it used in the Septuagint, which in the book of Isaiah is used to bring or to announce good news. But we also see it used in the larger Roman world. Hellenistic usage, we see as an example of that where Caesar's birthday, as the beginning of the new year, it is also good news for the entire world. So it is definitely not a term that is used strictly for Bible or strictly in Christianity. But in the New Testament, it does refer to the good news, and there are two ways to look at it. The good news preached by Jesus, that the kingdom of God or the reign of God is at hand. And so therefore God is coming to reign, and he's coming to reign forever, either presently in the present age or in the future. So that's the way it's used in the Gospels. The way Paul uses it in his letters is the good news of what God has done on behalf of humanity through Jesus Christ. And so that's a slightly different usage that we see in Paul's letters. But in any event, they both have to do with what Jesus is doing and what he is bringing to the world. It wasn't until the 2nd century CE that the word gospel took on the meaning of a book, such as the Gospel of Mark, or the Gospel of Matthew, or the Gospel of Luke, or the Gospel of John. That didn't take place until the 2nd century under Justin Martyr. So specifically in the New Testament, what are Gospels? In the New Testament, they narrate the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. But they are very, very selective. They are focused more on a person than events and lots of details. Although specific events such as healings and teachings and things like that help us to define who that person, and specifically we're talking about Jesus, who that person is. But as they narrate the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, they aren't biographies in the modern sense. It's not a biography of Jesus the way we would normally think about it. Gospels here resemble more Hellenistic biographies. We'll take a look at that during class, where what we have is a selective presentation of an individual's life. There are only specific details that teach moral lessons, or they promote a particular ideology, or they focus on that person's character as a good person, as a wise person, as a heroic person. And what we see in a document like this is a focus on a person's death, because the focus on a person's death and how a person dies reveals that person's character. So we see that a lot in Hellenistic biographies, and so what you'll see in the New Testament is some narrative that leads up to the most important portion of the gospel narratives, which is Jesus's rejection, suffering, and death. So in these documents, in these sort of Hellenistic biographies, Jesus's entire life is not what's relevant. So you're not going to always see an account of Jesus's birth. When we do see that, it's because it lends purpose to that specific narrative. So his entire life is not relative to what the gospel writer is trying to do. But what the gospel writer is trying to show is Jesus's character, is his identity, so that number one, we know who Jesus is for this community, and then number two, so that people can emulate his character. Okay, so how did the Gospels come to be? It is important to know that Jesus did not leave behind any written records of his ministry. His ministry ended roughly around 30 to 33 CE. There were at least 35 to 40 years that passed between Jesus' death and the first written gospel. And so, how is it that they came to be? These traditions, these stories were passed on orally from church to church, from generation to generation. And really, we're only talking about one generation. But these were passed on from one person to the next and from one community to the next. Well, how were they passed down? Here in this slide, you see different methods of oral transmission. For example, because remember that the Christian community was already in existence, what you see is his stories passed on in the context, for example, of preaching. These are the things that they said about Jesus, the miracles that he performed, the sayings that he taught, the different teachings that he was involved with his disciples and with the crowds that he came into contact with. The Greek word for that is kerygma. So when you see what was the kerygma spoken here, we're talking about what was it that they said about Jesus in the context of church preaching. So that's one method that the traditions were passed down. A second method is through apologetics. Apologetics is a defense or proof of the faith. And so when you talk about apologetic literature, it's not like they're saying we're sorry for our faith tradition. Apologetic literature seeks to defend the faith, seeks to say this faith tradition is a valid tradition. This faith tradition is not a tradition that is a threat to anybody, but it seeks to defend it in the face of persecution, for example. And we see that type of literature primarily in the Gospel of Luke. So we'll talk about that when we get there. So that's apologetic literature. People defending the faith. That's another way that these stories were passed along. Another way that they were passed along was through teaching, just regular teaching. As people were being converted to this faith, they had to be taught about the faith by whether it was the disciples, the original disciples, or other teachers. And so in the context of teaching and instructing new converts on what it meant to be a follower of Jesus, we see his stories being passed on that way. And then once again, because the church already existed, we did have worship services already. And so you will see references to baptism within the context of the Gospels, and which is the ritual of initiation with the dunking a person in water. We're sort of used to it by saying it's a christening or a sprinkling. This ritual replaced circumcision in the Jewish community. And then as well in worship services, we will see what we often refer to as the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper, which is the remembrance of Jesus' introduction of the new covenant. So 4 different contexts in which Jesus' stories were passed along: through preaching, through apologetics, through teaching, and through worship. So eventually, by the end of the first century or the early second century, written material of Jesus' life, his words, and his deeds in the form of the 4 Gospels existed. But why was this necessary? It took a way longer time for the material in the Hebrew Bible to be formed from oral tradition to written story, we're talking about a period of over 1,000 years. Here we're talking about a period of only 30 to 35. So why did the church begin to produce written records of the traditions of Jesus? Well, it seems like there were several factors that contributed to this move. Number one, the parousia had not occurred as expected. And you're saying, what is that? What is the parousia? The parousia is the second coming of Jesus. The first generation Christians expected Jesus to come back any day. They expected him to come back next week. They felt that it was immediate. But after a period of time, his coming did not happen. And so to preserve those traditions, these materials started getting written down. But secondly, through this period, the eyewitnesses of Jesus' life were dying off. And so they needed a source for these traditions that was authoritative and that could be preserved so that the traditions weren't so fluid. Thirdly, the missionary needs of the church necessitated that resources existed to teach new converts about Christian beliefs and practices. And then finally, just the mere growth of the Christian movement necessitated correct understandings of who Jesus was. There were lots of viewpoints on that, and so it was necessary to have documents written down that could refute false teachings about who Jesus was. So basically, you have a very long and indirect process of development for these New Testament Gospels. These traditions passed along orally. This is what the final form of them was, these four written Gospels. One scholar says this: forming the first section of the New Testament, these four Gospels not only are our primary sources for historical information about Jesus, but also express the foundational beliefs of what became a new world religion. And it's those beliefs and that religious experience that's very, very important in understanding what these Gospels are all about. So we have four Gospels. Well, why do we have four? Well, the four, they represent different responses to Jesus' ministry. We've got a tapestry of story that represents four distinctive ways of telling it. It represents the rich diversity of first century Christianity. We talked about the diversity of Judaism. Christianity was diverse as well. But even though there was that diversity in Christianity, what unified Christians everywhere, and this is absolutely important, is the belief in the fact that Jesus rose. It is on that claim itself, that Jesus rose from the dead, that unified Christians everywhere. And because this belief unified Christians everywhere, that is what unifies as well the gospel narratives that we have in the New Testament. Okay, so we have the four gospels. We have what is referred to as the synoptic gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. They're referred to as synoptic. They have a common view. They share symbols such as Torah, such as the temple, synagogue, those types of things. And they have the same narrative framework. In other words, they tell the same story throughout, pretty much in the same order. However, there are differences, and we'll talk about the differences and the reason for those a little bit later on. But just so you know, Mark, Matthew, and Luke are referred to as the synoptic gospels. And then you have the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John has much unique material, and you'll find that 90% of the Gospel of John is unique. In other words, 90% of the material in John does not appear in Mark, Matthew, and Luke. So you have the synoptic Gospels as well as the Gospel of John. And each one presents Jesus in a very, very different way. Mark looks at Jesus as the suffering Messiah. Matthew looks at Jesus as the authoritative interpreter and fulfillment, personification of Torah. Luke looks at him as the one who liberates the oppressed, and John looks at him as one who reveals who God is. So this is what we're going to look at as we look through the Gospels. Thanks.